From Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler. Hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather around the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. Cattle mutilations, or strange and unexplained livestock deaths, missing vital organs and soft tissue, seemingly removed with surgical precision. No sign of struggle, no blood, no indication that the death was caused by natural predators. Bovine excision, my friends, that's where we're headed. And field investigator into the high strange, Chris O'Brien, is standing by to discuss. First, a few programming notes. There is no live YouTube stream tonight, no live YouTube stream. And that means no live chat. Sorry about that, but the live YouTube stream will return next week. Also, no What's in the Box segment, no remote viewing experiment, but that too will return next week. And we have instituted, as you know, a new format here on the Conspiracy Show. We have usually in the first hour a panel and more guests, shorter segments. But from time to time, we have to deviate from that format, and tonight is one of those times. So next week we will be back to our regular format. Albert and Ryan will be here. Our panel will be back. Media scientist Nelson Thal and Joel Skousen, the editor and publisher of World Affairs Brief, will be here. And in the second hour, open lines, followed by Dr. Stephen Greer. A typical cattle mutilation story begins when the remains of a victim animal have been discovered. Most commonly, the remains have been found in some open field by a rancher, farmer, or other unlucky individual. The animal in question is commonly reported to have been in good health just days prior to the discovery, so the death is unexpected and natural causes seem unlikely. The body itself appears to have been mutilated after death. Oftentimes, external body parts are missing, such as the ears, the eyes, the sex organs, or the tongue. In some cases, flesh even appears to have been stripped off of the skull. Witnesses insist that the edges of the wounds are smooth and clean, as though done with a surgeon's scalpel. A scalpel also appears to have split open the stomach of many animals, and internal organs have been removed. A conspicuous absence of blood is another common feature. Always, the witnesses claim that there are no footprints, tire tracks, or scavenger prints leading either towards or away from the body. The death is a mystery, and foul play of some kind is assumed. Okay, let's talk cattle mutilations. From 1992 to 2002, Christopher O'Brien investigated over 1,000 paranormal events reported in the San Luis Valley, located in south-central Colorado, north-central New Mexico, working with law enforcement officials, ex-military, ranchers, and an extensive network of skywatchers. He documented what may have been the most intense wave of unexplained activity ever seen in a single region of North America. His 10-year investigation resulted in 3 books of his Mysterious Valley trilogy: The Mysterious Valley, Enter the Valley, and Secrets of the Mysterious Valley. His meticulous field investigation of UFO reports, unexplained livestock deaths, haunted sites, Native American legends, cryptozoology, secret military activity, and the folklore found in the world's largest alpine valley has produced one of the largest databases of unusual occurrences gathered from a single geographic region. He's currently working with a team of specialists installing a high-tech video surveillance and hard data monitoring system in and around the San Luis Valley. His latest book is Stalking the Herd, and it's published by Adventures Unlimited Press. Chris, welcome to the Conspiracy Show. How are you?
Very good. Thank you for having me, Richard.
If you were to put pins on a big map of the United States, could we identify clusters where these cattle mutilations, livestock mutilations are happening?
Yeah, we've been doing that for over 40 years. We do actually have an extensive map that shows areas of high incidence, which for the most part are I would say generally are in the Rocky Mountain states up into Alberta, and then across the Midwest and across the Canadian plains, all the way to the Mississippi, and then they start to drop off on the extreme East Coast and on the extreme West Coast. pretty much the middle of the country is where you'll have more pins in places than the map will actually be able to take.
What I like about your work, Chris, is you approach this as a hard-nosed skeptic, and we don't hear a lot from you necessarily about UFOs and tractor beams taking cows on board motherships and dropping them in strange places and that sort of thing. But break it down for me. The percentage with your personal experience in investigations, the percentage that are readily explainable by natural predation or some other natural, more prosaic explanation, and those what you sort of categorize as the high strange.
Well, for the most part, the ranchers and the ranching community does not report scavenger predator kills and scavenging for the most part. 2% of their herds die every year, and they're used to seeing dead animals. They're used to seeing what happens once they die, how from a variety of scavengers, from the four-legged varmints to birds, to insects, maggot blooms, that sort of thing. They're very, very familiar with the process that occurs after an animal dies. It's these stranger cases that tend to be the ones that get reported. But you really have to analyze this as a societal in a societal context. If local papers get a hold of real cases that are apparently high strange, not only to the rancher, but to investigators and law enforcement, if papers get a hold of that and write an article, then you might even see a few cases that are misidentified by people just passing by a pasture and seeing a dead cow and looking at what's a natural process and because they're not familiar with it, thinking that it's high strange. So that tends to generate a few false positives, if you will. It's only when you really hit the regional news services that it really creates a lot of problems with misidentified scavenger action. Scavengers are very, very, very efficient. And I've seen magpies, for instance, carve a perfectly circular hole in the rear end of a cow that looks like it could have been drawn with a compass. Some of these unusual scavenger action appearance, if you will, can fool even veterinarians. So it's really difficult to put numbers on it. I would say that out of the real cases that appear to have been cut with a sharp implement, that maybe 10% are really high strange, and the other, let's say 80 to 90% could very well have been done by skillful humans wielding fairly sophisticated surgery techniques.
10% still. I mean, that sounds like a small number, but when we're talking about this arena, 10% is a sizable number. Christopher O'Brien is with us. His latest book is Stalking the Herd. Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery. Stalking the Herd, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery. And his website is OurStrangePlanet.com. You began sort of describing some of the outward appearances of one of these cattle mutilation cases, and that is the excision, various parts of the cow, of the livestock.
The soft tissue organs.
The soft tissue organs.
Like an eye will be missing, possibly an ear will be excised with a neat circle around the ear down to the skull. Often, if it's a female, the female reproductive organs are taken out like a plug, sometimes 18, 20 inches deep into the animal. The udder, part of the udder, the entire udder, oftentimes is reported missing. The real telltale sign that investigators look for, and this sign is what makes the case into a classic mute, as we call them, or a classic mutilation, is when the mandible flesh on the jaw is excised and expertly cut away, and the jawbone is unnaturally white. There's very, very little, if any, tissue, muscle, any sort of, soft organic tissue on the jawbone. And generally that would indicate that the tongue has been excised from deep within the throat, and possibly some of the, your glands, in the throat, could possibly have been taken. So it's generally the organs that humans develop cancer, most readily, interestingly enough. And
that are removed.
You know, these are also the organs that scavengers go after too, because they're soft tissue, and it's the easiest way into the body cavity where all the the delectables are. So you have to be very careful when you're looking at these cases. Only a veterinary pathologist really is in a position to determine whether an animal has been, targeted with intelligence, shall we say. I'm not a veterinary pathologist, but I've been taking notes for a long time. I've been out with veterinarians, with crime scene investigators and law enforcement, with brand inspectors, and you tend to become a little bit more up to speed, and your learning curve tends to flatten out once you've been out on several dozen cases. I personally have been out on around 200.
And again, of those, you would say 10% are categorized as high strange?
Well, 40%, 40 of them, let's say, 40, I would say 40 out of those 200 were definitely, without any question in my mind, these animals were killed somehow, targeted, and then experimented on with surgery. And out of those, there were about six or seven that really were freaky, that had some of the earmarks of a high strange case, a paranormal case even. I think at the very core, we're dealing with something supernatural. I think there is some sort of undefined predator that's lurking about in the ethers, if you will, for lack of a better description. And I think that the human cases are trying to figure out maybe what that predator intelligence, what it's up to. And so I think the human cases tend to happen afterwards, and they tend to spread out from the initial case. And, then you'll have helicopter sightings, which are rarely mentioned, by some of the more popular researchers out there that have their little cults of personality and, are trying to convince everybody this is aliens. They forget about the over 400 or so helicopter sightings that have been documented in and around mutilation sites since the mid-70s, early to mid-70s. So
how did that start, Chris? How did we and we just have 2 minutes, we'll start this conversation now and then pick it up on again after the break. But how did this connection between cattle mutilations and UFOs begin?
Very simply, the very first publicized case that went around the world, the very first really well-known case, occurred in the San Luis Valley, where I lived for 13 years, right near the Great Sand Dunes. And it was the Snippy the horse case. And the animal was found, it was an Appaloosa horse found with all the tissue and muscle and flesh and hide missing from the tip of its nose all the way to its shoulders. And when the story was kind of covered up for about 3 weeks or a month, and then the owner came out and told the regional press that flying saucers had come down and killed her horse. And the link has been there ever since.
All right.
That was in 67.
1967. Here we are 50 years later. Yep. But that may sort of, for many people in the public's consciousness, be sort of patient zero or victim zero, if you will. But you've looked back. I mean, cattle mutilations, the high strange variety, go back far more into our past, hundreds and hundreds of years, right?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. The earliest recorded case I can find was actually hundreds of sheep that were mutilated in and around London in 1606.
The time of King James I reign, I guess.
Correct. Just a few weeks after the Guy Fawkes gunpowder plot, right when Shakespeare was finishing up Macbeth and starting rehearsals at the Globe Theater, and James I was rewriting the Christian Bible.
All right, interesting context there. All right, we'll take a time out, come back. Christopher O'Brien is with us, stalking the herd, unraveling the cattle mutilation mystery. OurStrangePlanet.com is his website, and we'll come back and discuss further. Stay with us.
Corporations, governments, and sometimes entire civilizations. What goes up must come down. And it lands on The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
We are back with Christopher O'Brien, and it is truly one of the most disturbing, befuddling phenomenons I've ever come across. Cattle mutilation, also known as bovine excision, or unexplained livestock death, and the killing and mutilation of cattle under unusually unusual rather, and often, well, this is another sort of area of contention. We hear that these poor creatures have been exsanguinated, totally drained of their blood. But then along comes a level-headed investigator like Christopher O'Brien and says, "Now hold on a minute, This is not, what it appears to be. These, by and large, these mutilated cattle are not drained of every drop of blood, are they?"
The vast majority, no, they're not. There are a few that are drained of blood, and those generally are the high strange ones that we really can't figure out. Can't figure out what technology could actually do that. When you cut into the meat of a dead animal, if the meat's pink into red, obviously there's blood in there. But if you cut into it and the meat is pale pink or gray, then that would indicate that there's been some sort of exsanguination process that has occurred, whether the animal has been tapped and pumped its own blood out, or whether there's some type of machine that can do it. But these cases are really rare in my estimation, based on my experience. A lot of times when the rancher approaches the animal, he looks down at it, and of course he's horrified because he's lost anywhere from 500 to many thousands of dollars of an investment. And he looks at it and he doesn't see, maybe the wounds are bleeding. He doesn't notice any real apparent blood. Well, you just got to remember your basic science. Gravity has a habit of pulling liquids down to the lowest point in the body, creating lividity and pooling the blood in the lower extremities and in the body cavity. And I don't know how many times that I've had a rancher say, "Well, they drained this animal of blood," and I'd say, "Well, here, give me a hand," and we'd flip it over, and whoosh, here comes all the, granted, a lot of the moisture has been wicked away. I do live in, at the time I lived in a semi-arid desert, so especially in the dry climate, you're going to have a lot of the moisture is going to wick away from the blood, and you'll just have the hemoglobin and lots of red blood cells and the more visceral parts of the aspect of the blood will be there in the body cavity, and all you have to do is turn it over, and there's all your constituent elements. So, in my experience, the draining of blood is, I think it's rather the exception than the norm.
Right, but there have been exceptions. Tell me about the 200 or so cattle mutilation cases you've investigated in the field. I mean, you don't just write about this stuff and look at newspaper headlines. You're roll up your sleeves, get dirt under your fingernails. You go out into the field and examine these creatures. Give me your best high strange case, your best one.
Well, the Del Norte calf was by far the one that was the most disturbing to me. The sheriff got a call from a rancher, went out there in the town of Del Norte, which is on the western side of the center of the San Luis Valley, which is the world's largest alpine valley. We're talking at an altitude of the valley floor at 7,500 feet, totally ringed by mountains, going up, 14ers. We have 14,000-foot mountains, and then a whole slew of 10 to 13 that surround the entire valley. And Del Norte is in Rio Grande County, and the sheriff went out there, and it just snowed. This was early March, 1998. It had just snowed 5 inches the night before, and the rancher had found the animal out in the pasture, lying in a pristine snowfall. The heat of the animal had evaporated the snow, but its imprint lay perfectly untouched in the snow, and the animal was missing its entire front leg, which was taken away. The upper respiratory organs, the rib cage, and the spine had been taken. The spine had been snapped out in an upwards motion, which is impossible because the hide was there. So we don't know how actually they got the spine out, because by the way that the remaining discs at the base of the skull and at the top of the hips, the way those discs were situated, the spine couldn't have been taken out through the excision that took away the leg. It was very strange. There was absolutely no blood. The heart and liver had been perfectly excised.
Not a drop of blood
laid in the body cavity.
Not a drop anywhere.
No. Well, there's one drop on the left rear hoof.
Okay.
But there was not one drop of blood in a pristine 5-inch snowfall. Now, I don't know how you explain that. The brain was missing. It had a completely dry brain case. There was no break into the cranium.
Oh, my
One
Lord.
eye was gone. The animal appeared to have some sort of retarded necrotic process somehow. There was no smell of rot. He dragged it into a heated garage for several days, I think about a week. And when I went back there, I literally put my nose down to the carcass, and I could not smell one cadaverine molecule, which is the molecule that makes dead meat stink.
Right.
Instead, I smelt this faint smell of like a medicinal smell, some sort of antiseptic type smell.
Wasn't formaldehyde?
No, it wasn't formalin or formaldehyde, but it smelled like some sort of antiseptic, like they would put on a patient before they perform surgery. This animal was definitely targeted. There was no question about it. There were no tracks anywhere. The rest of the herd was completely spooked, all the way at the other side of the pasture, and extremely agitated. The rancher really knew his stuff. He's one of the better ranchers in the area, and we did have strange light reports from two different sources, two different witnesses. The night we think that the animal was targeted, people saw strange lights out in the pastures in that part of the county. So
what does that mean,
that one went
Chris?
down in my my book as the most spectacular one or most startling one.
I'll say. But what does that mean, strange lights? I mean, could it have been a helicopter, maybe some government agency swoops down without getting out of the helicopter, without landing? They scoop up this hapless creature, take it back to a lab somewhere, and use, who knows, lasers or whatever. I mean, is that within the realm of possibility?
Yeah, it is. This particular animal did not appear to have any sort of high heat involved as a cutting agent. Those cases are fairly rare. You get this pop culture sort of view of this, that all these animals are being cut by lasers. No, they're not. Very, very few. I only had a handful, 3 or 4, I think, that showed any evidence of high heat. They do occur, but again, they're just a small percentage of the cases. I have a theory that these animals are being targeted by helicopters. There may be some sort of apparatus underneath, some sort of claw that's able to grab them. We found animals with lots of bruising on their backs. We've had many, many animals, hundreds of animals have been described as being dropped from a great height with horns driven into the skull, all the bones broken, legs twisted around from hitting the ground at extreme speed with all the weight of the animal behind it. So I have this theory that they're picking them up somehow, and they're taking them to a secluded spot that has a semi-truck sitting there. But the semi-truck has a retractable roof or ceiling on the trailer, and they just drop it right in onto some sort of operating table after darting the animal and rendering it incapacitated. This would be the most obvious way to get the smaller animals, the heifers and the younger animals. Now, how are you going to do that to a 2,500 pound Angus bull or a scimitar or, some of these huge, bulls that have been reported mutilated? I don't know. You'd be very hard pressed to have a helicopter that could even lift one. Some of them are so big, without, a helicopter without, drawing lots of attention. But, in rural areas, a lot of times, these animals are out of sight of highways or roads or out of sight of ranching homes. They tend to be, a good deal of them tend to be fairly, in the farther reaches of the ranch. And, that, I think by targeting those animals, it accomplishes several things. One, they might not be discovered for a few days, which would then render any sort of post-mortem investigation impossible because the animal's already starting to rot. And the other thing, again, as I described, is they're going to be out of sight. And, maybe the ranch animals won't bark or the dogs won't bark. And it's just going to, I think, it's going to create a situation more conducive for stealth. Let's put it that way.
Christopher O'Brien is with us, and his latest book is Stalking the Herd, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery. OurStrangePlanet.com is the website. Let's look at one of the more prosaic explanations, which really isn't all that prosaic. I mean, it's pretty bizarre. But let's say it is, the Men in Black, a helicopter. It's some government agency, and they're doing these experiments on these cattle. What are they looking for? Prions that cause mad cow? Are they tracking virulent diseases? What are they doing?
Yeah, that makes the most sense to me, and I'm not the only one that has that particular theory at the top of my list. The National Institute for Discovery Sciences, NIDS, famous for buying the Utah Skinwalker Ranch, Robert Bigelow's group back in the 90s and 2000, up to, I think they were an organization until 2005. They had a really good veterinary pathologist that went out to these cases. The managing director was a microbiologist named Colm Kelleher, and he wrote a book called Brain Trust, which looked at the outbreak of mad cow in Canada, and then the outbreak of mutilations quickly occurring around the region, almost methodically around the area where the animal with the prion disease was discovered. And he came up with a theory that, yeah, that's what's going on. We're seeing a monitoring of some sort of quasi-governmental monitoring of the food chain, basically, and it's not where the cow is. It's where the cow is in the environment. And so it seems like there's environmental sampling going on. I had interesting paper article was sent to me from the Westward magazine in Denver, and it was an expose by a former EPA scientist named Brian Rimmer. He had been tasked with raising sheep and other grazing animals along the Alamosa River in the San Luis Valley, and the reason being is up river in the mountains, right near the Superfund site at the Summitville gold mine, they had trashed the upper 17 to 20 miles of the river with heavy metals and arsenic and just nasty stuff, and just killed everything. And so he was downstream 40 miles down and out into the valley. And this, you got to understand that this river has lots of canals that feed off into irrigation systems for farmers and ranch, and water for ranchers, and water for people's drinking water as well, the water table there. So he was tasked with raising animals for 90 days, and then they would take the animals, take them into the laboratory, snuff them, and then do workups on their organs and see what the effect of the Superfund cleanup site had on the water.
Sure.
Well, they found incredible amounts of copper and other heavy metals, and he went to his superior and said, "Look, I can't even believe these animals are still alive. We should warn the farmers and ranchers, that we found these results." And he was forbidden to. The EPA said, "No, you're not. You're not going to start a panic." And he got so incensed that he actually quit his job, and he did a whistleblower expose with Westward magazine and actually sued the EPA. Well, I find it interesting during that time period, if you went a few miles down the river, that's where I had 7 mutilation cases.
Aha, I see what's going on
right on
here.
the Alamosa River, and also on some of the canals and feeder ditches that come off the Alamosa River. But all the mutes were on waterways that were coming directly from the Alamosa River over about an 18-month period.
Bingo. We're heading into a break, but here it is. So now, instead of trusting some farmer to raise these cattle for 90 days so they can experiment, they don't want any more whistleblowers. They're going to do it in the dead of the night, on their own, no questions asked, and no restitution to the poor rancher. Back with more of my conversation with Christopher O'Brien, Stalking the Herd, right here on The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
This is no place for the naive or the faint-hearted. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
We continue to delve into one of the most, is one of the most bizarre phenomenon I've ever come across in doing this program for 20 years, and that is the cattle mutilation phenomenon. Christopher O'Brien is the author of Stalking the Herd, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery, and he is a field investigator. He rolls up his sleeves and he gets down and dirty and really approaches this, I think, like no other, with a real level head and a rational mind, and doesn't jump to conclusions, and probably has taken considerable heat for that from others that would like to sensationalize this. Am I correct, Chris?
Oh boy, you are. I've been trying to. I mean, just when I first started doing this investigative work in '93, I went around to the well-known investigators and I said, they're always moaning about how they don't get any respect, they don't get any attention. This is, really a serious subject. And I said, well, maybe the word mutilation itself just kind of turns people off. Why don't you come up with a better way of describing these things? Oh no, that's shock value. We need that. And it's like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you want to have shock value and not turn people off, you have to come up with a better term that's more accurate. These animals are not mutilated. Mutilation to me is almost like just a frenzied hacking.
Right, like being mangled.
Expertly experimented on.
They're not mangled. They are, that's right. They are experimented on. We were talking about a possibility that the EPA may be behind this, that now they are surreptitiously testing these animals because they tried it the other way. They had somebody raise the cattle for 90 days. Then they did the experiments. They found something, heavy metal contamination. Then they didn't want to divulge it and cause a panic. So then they created a whistleblower scenario. So they want to avoid that now. Is that what's going on? Yeah. So now they're doing it in the dead of night?
And I think, people say, well, why don't they just take the animals? And, they did that in 71. They did not leave the animals behind. And all these cases turned into grand theft larceny cases. Because the animals were taken. Police reports are being filed. People, all the ranchers in Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, where all these cases were occurring, they were starting to form vigilante groups, run around armed, shoot at helicopters. And then in 72, not one case was reported, not one mutilation was reported. And all this stolen animal scenario totally chilled out and quieted down. And then in 73, boom, we had the start of the modern phase of the mutilation phenomenon where the animals were left behind. Now think about it. When you leave the animal behind, what are you accomplishing? One, there is no stolen property. Two, you always have plausible deniability. You can always say, oh, it's just predator and scavengers. You don't know what you're looking at. And three, you can target certain ranching communities to maybe subjugate them, then put them in fear. A lot of these areas of high incidence also have lots of militia groups and very patriotic Americans, which is something that you don't really hear about too much from the other popular investigators. You also don't hear...
Wait, let me just hang on. Let me follow up on that thread. So what are you... Right. They're trying to intimidate these patriot groups? Is that what they're trying to do?
I think so. And it's also funny how mad cow disease broke out in the woods, where some of the most radical rancher sort of militia types live in Weld County and upper northeast
the preppers,
Colorado. Say again?
The preppers.
Yeah, the prepper types, exactly. And southwestern corner of Nebraska. You have a very, very strong patriot militia presence in these areas. And I find it interesting that mad cow should break out in all the deer herds and all these guys go there to hunt. So, that's a whole different topic. But basically, there's another theory, too, that has not gotten, that's gotten short shrift, shall we say. And that is 70 to 80% of the ranches that were hit by the mutilators in the 70s are gone. And instead, there's huge industrial feedlots and, modern super agricultural operations, super feedlots, and these industrialized operations where hundreds of thousands of animals are living in these filthy conditions, and they have to pump, 80% of the antibiotics used in America goes into cattle, 60% of the growth hormones used, a sizable percentage of steroids. And, they try to get these animals fat as quickly as they can. They feed them grain, which they're not really designed by nature to properly metabolize.
GMO cotton and alfalfa. Yeah.
They have to keep them in these terribly filthy conditions. They're walking around in a foot to 2 feet of feces and urine. They have to get them out of there as quickly as possible. So they pump them full of growth hormones, pump them full of antibiotics, pump them full of steroids. And these animals used to be living free range on small mom and pop ranches. 70 to 80% of them are gone. And I think that back in the 70s, we have cases where large ranching concerns were using the mutilation phenomenon as a way to intimidate smaller ranchers to either run them off or have them sell their land or try to put them out of business. And I have some really good data and law enforcement evidence to back this up.
I'm sure you do, Chris. And you mentioned, giving it short shrift, and unfortunately we'll have to do that. We'll take a time out, come back. We can touch on that a little bit more. But then there's the other, less prosaic, the high strange cases that may involve the supernatural. Chris O'Brien, Stalking the Herd. Back with more in a moment. Don't go away.
Loose lips sink ships, and sometimes corporations.
We are back with Christopher O'Brien, OurStrangePlanet.com, and the book is Stalking the Herd, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery. So the sinister motive here, driving mom and pop ranchers off the land so they could be replaced with these basically sort of industrial farming. And we have to be careful. This is how Oprah Winfrey got in trouble with the beef industry. So.
I love hamburgers. I love steaks.
Me too.
But I like them free range, from my local neighborhood here. I can just go up to the top of the hill here and look down on the herd.
There you go.
So local mumia, I think as the Greeks called it. I don't eat industrialized beef protein. I don't eat much beef really at all, but when I do, I like to know where it's from and how it's raised.
It begs the question is whether the more high, what am I trying to say here? The people that are involved in this arena, as you are, but are far more sensational. Is it, I don't want to mention any names here, but is it possible that they are in cahoots? Because they seem to be really pushing this, the high strange, the UFO, the alien connection.
It's their careers. They're just trying to sensationalize it, create, put more butts in the conference seats, to be on TV, to, they pay their bills with this work. I don't. I'm an amateur that has a life. I'm actually kind of semi-retired from the mutilation, field investigating. It's my least favorite thing to do in life is to roll up on a dead necrotic cow that's been sitting there a little too long. It's nasty. It's disgusting. I really don't like it. So I moved to one of the states that has some of the fewest numbers of mutilations so I can not be called up and dragged out of bed or, whatever. I've ridden up to 2.5, 3 hours to a case. Just, the rancher's wife called me, and then I get there and come to find out the rancher didn't want her to call. He took the animal and buried it with a backhoe and took off in his truck. And, I had to try to track him down around town. And, he ducked me. And, it was 6 hours of driving time.
Oh my.
Just to get there and back. So, I'm really not, I'm not too unhappy, not having to go out on cases.
Chris, put your feet up. Go lie
on my truck in 6 years.
Oh, go, put your feet up. Go lie down in a crop circle.
There you go. Right.
So let's talk about those high strange cases, though. The one that even have you scratching your head. You mentioned the skull that had the brain had been removed from the calf's skull, the spine excised in a strange manner. Assuming that these aren't EPA members doing this, what's the other possibility here? Something supernatural you mentioned.
Well, that's the only thing that I can really think of. I think that there's some sort of as yet undefined predator that has possibly some sort of dimensional capability, time-based, I don't know. But it's something that is definitely paranormal in nature. I think, the popular conception is it's aliens coming down to gather genetic material to help shore up their dying race and to help strengthen their gene pool and all this. And it's all the blood and genetic material they're after. Well, my answer is very simple to that, and I will win any argument. If they were so interested in genetic material and blood, why don't they just pick lock on a feedlot and go inside and get all the genetic material they need, and nobody would be the wiser.
Right.
It just doesn't make sense that the aliens would be sneaking around out in the pastures of the world. And out of my list of suspects, ETs from outside of our closed system would be the least likely scenario in my book. That's not saying that we don't have high strange cases. We do. And they're very, very spooky. And when a rancher has one of those, chances are he's not going to report it because it's so scary. He doesn't want any attention drawn to himself. And so those cases are the least likely cases to be reported. The cases that are most likely to be reported are ranchers who don't know what they're looking at, who are real rank amateurs, which have been several of those in recent years in southern Colorado. Ranchers that have ulterior motives like insurance claims, that sort of thing. That's another possible reason for them to come forward. But the main reason to come forward is if they think that they've been targeted, if they've seen weird convoys of SUVs, if they've seen helicopters buzzing around, unusual aerial, mundane aerial activity, but unusual around their ranch, then they think that maybe the government has for some reason targeted them, and that tends to get them angry, and then they'll be more likely to go to the sheriff and report it. But by now, after 40, 50 years of this, ranchers are pretty up to speed on it, and they know that if they report it, nothing really is going to happen. I mean, there's no real recourse. You're just going to bring down, these hotshot glam investigators coming in and trying to get you on coast to coast, and trying to get TV shows to come and talk to you and all that. They're pretty gun shy when it comes to this, and generally the cases that I got were cases I had to ferret out. People would say, "Oh, my neighbor, I heard my neighbor had one of these," or somebody would say, my uncle, he had a ranch and he had these cases happen. You should definitely talk to him. And sometimes it would take me 2 to 3 weeks or months even to get these people to open up. But the best cases are the ones where the people don't report them. They don't go to law enforcement. They don't go to the media. They don't go to these, investigator types or the newspapers or whatever.
I agree. Those are the most credible because, they're not looking for publicity. I just wanted to backtrack a little minute in talking about the possible alien connection. And like you, I don't believe it. You're right. It would be far easier to pick the lock on a feedlot. But here's the other reason I don't think they'd be traveling light years to do this. In order for them to travel here, they would have had to have harnessed the power of the sun, essentially. So if they need to create a certain protein or DNA molecule, they could essentially just snap their fingers, I would think. They don't need to travel, 4 or 5 light years to do it.
Well, and I agree. And it's like in the abduction phenomenon. There's investigators walking around with cases filled with all these recovered implants. Well, all this stuff started before we really got into nanotechnology. I mean, you would think that an alien race, 1,000 years ahead of us, a million years ahead of us, would have something akin to, some sort of nanotech that you could never recover. You can never find it. Even probably transmitting ones that transmit in a way that we couldn't detect. Everybody kind of looks at these mysteries, I think, too simplistically. They don't really, they don't use the power of rational thought. They just want to sensationalize and tell people, these spooky stories. And to me, that is what is wrong with the field and why we're not taken more seriously by law enforcement and by the medical field and the diagnostic medical field. I think it's really important to try to be as circumspect about these cases and as open-minded and don't bang some sort of agenda drum and try to find, only look at the cases that conform to your particular foregone conclusion. And these investigators do tend to, accent the cases where strange lights are seen, even structured craft, have been seen around mutilation sites. I'm not saying these cases don't happen, but they're extremely rare compared to the vast majority of cases. And so why look at 1 or 2% of the data and pretend the other 98% isn't there? That to me is intellectual dishonesty, and I just won't go there. I don't need to create a cult of personality and pay bills with this work.
Well, and again, that's what makes you, I think, by far the most credible researcher in this field. But I do want to circle back to the high strange again and the possibility that we are talking about, after having said all that, these few cases that have you up a tree, and there could be some supernatural paranormal explanation. Is there anything?
I love David Perkins' idea. he seems to think that, collectively, if you go with the Jungarian sort of, view or idea, hypothesis of the collective human unconscious, collectively on an unconscious level, we know that cattle are extremely detrimental to the environment. They're the largest source of freshwater pollution, the largest source of the creation of deserts, the single main reason why we're cutting down rainforests. They harbor horrific diseases, such as, the prion disease, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy. I have a hard time saying that word.
I won't even touch that one.
Encephalopathy.
We need a whole show for that.
My tongue doesn't like that word. Anyway, it's called PSC, or mad cow disease.
Yeah.
So, I just really have a sense that, this is a lot more complicated. Let's put it that way. A lot more complicated than a single one-size-fits-all answer. I think there are multiple groups involved. David Perkins' idea of the collective unconscious manifesting some sort of societal angst that's creating warnings for ourselves to stop using beef as a protein source. We've all heard of stigmata, right?
Yes.
All these animal death cases, by the way, only occur in Christian countries, which no other investigators really figured out. Only Christian countries have these
it's an
unusual livestock deaths.
It's an excellent point, because
you've heard of stigmata, right?
Yes, of course.
Okay, well, how about if there's some sort of cultural stigmata that we're actually collectively targeting these animals and having spontaneous manifestations of collective angst about cattle in the environment? So maybe it's us doing this. I love that theory. It touches on Gaian theory,
Right.
If you will, or earth science theory. It touches on the collective unconscious and the ability of the mass to actually create a spontaneous effect in the environment. I think it's a fascinating theory. I don't think enough creative thinking has been applied to this whole thing, and not enough diagnostic veterinary pathology either.
Right. We just have about 2 minutes left. I just very quickly want to touch on this, because I know that you have studied folklore from various Aboriginal groups. I'm guessing maybe in that region, the Pueblos and the Navajos and so forth. Is there anything?
Well, the Hopi and Zuni. The Navajo were just arrived before the Spanish.
All right. Anything in their folklore, their legends, that might provide some hint? And we have about 2 minutes here.
Not really. I don't see any real correlations within the Native American communities. They do have certain legends of creatures, but they tend to be targeting the Indians themselves, not the animals. So, to my knowledge, no. And I've done quite a bit of digging on this. I did have the last traditional elder, the Hopi, was a pretty close friend for 15 years. Grandfather Martin. One of my dearest friends is a Zuni elder, Clifford Mahudi. I've talked to a lot of Native Americans, and they just don't have. They didn't see this type of thing occurring to the wild game here. Although buffalo, deer, elk have all been found mutilated in the modern era. Pigs, swine, goats, sheep. Even a coyote was found mutilated, lying next to a mutilated cow I had once. So,
wow.
So, in answer to your question, no.
All right, Chris, thank you so much for this. I enjoyed talking with you immensely, and we'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Richard, for having me on, and thanks for having me on Coast to Coast as well.
Anytime, my friend. Christopher O'Brien. The book is Stalking the Herd, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery, and his website is OurStrangePlanet.com. All right, more show to come. Stay where you are. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Syrett, S-Y, because I love you, R-E-T-T. And as always, follow the truth.
From Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Thanks for inviting me into your home, long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' basement, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. A special hello to all of you receiving this transmission on one of our affiliate stations, and hello to all of you catching the podcast on TalkZone.com. The YouTube channel, of course, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett. Don't forget to hit subscribe. And finally, those of you who take The Conspiracy Show with you on your mobile device with the Conspiracy Show app. However, and wherever you're listening, I bid thee the warmest of welcomes, and I thank you for your fine company. A couple of weeks ago, we lost rock historian, best-selling author, and a truly remarkable human being, R. Gary Patterson. Gary appeared with me on various radio programs, both here on Zoomer Radio and other radio stations, numerous times. He was a fan favorite on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie and Ian Punnett. He appeared on Coast with me as well. Gary died suddenly in his home near Knoxville back on Friday, May the 26th. He and I were working on a radio project at the time called Spirit of Rock Radio. And we were very close to launching that show on a station in Knoxville when Gary died suddenly. You can check out that show website and listen to the pilot episode we produced at spiritofrockradio.com, spiritofrockradio.com. And I plan on pushing ahead with that project, although it certainly won't be the same without Gary, but I know he would want me to see that project through. Again, it's spiritofrockradio.com. Tonight, this morning, I thought it would be fitting to jump into the time machine and go back a little ways to February 2016 and replay a show marking the anniversary of the day the music died, Feb 3rd, 1959, of course, the plane crash that took the lives of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper. Here now is R. Gary Patterson, along with Peggy Sue Guerin, dear friend of Buddy Holly, and the inspiration for Buddy Holly classics Peggy Sue and Peggy Sue Got Married. Here's how that show sounded.
We interrupt this program for a special news bulletin. 3 young singers who soared to the heights of show business and the current rock and roll craze were killed today in the crash of a light plane in an Iowa snow flurry. The singers were identified as Ritchie Valens, 17, Buddy Holly, 22, and J.P. Richardson, known professionally as the Big Bopper. The aircraft chartered from the Dwyer Flying Service crashed near Mason City, ironically the setting for the prominent musical...
All right, as I say, hard to believe. Almost 6 decades since the plane crash near Clear Lake, Iowa, that took the lives of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, J.P. Richardson, the Big Bopper, of course, and the pilot, Roger Peterson. They were on their way to the next stop in their winter dance party, which was in Minnesota. Didn't make it, obviously. And that's where we're going to delve into over the next 45 minutes or so. R. Gary Patterson, a good friend of the program and mine, a native Tennessean with a passion for rock and roll. Gary researches, chronicles some of the most enduring mysteries of rock. He's the author of The Walrus Was Paul, Hellhounds on Their Trail, Tales from the Rock and Roll Graveyard, and Take a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll Myths, Legends, and Curses. Gary Patterson, welcome back to The Conspiracy Show. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. How are you, Richard?
Very well. How are things down in Knoxville?
Well, it's strange weather. It was snowing last week and in the 60s today, so I like a variety.
Now, I'm not telling tales out of school. I think you're a little bit older than me. Do you remember Buddy Holly growing up, or were you too young?
I was actually just a little too young, but I remember going to a record store, and I was looking through albums, and I saw this guy with these really black glasses on. I kept saying, well, this guy doesn't look rock and roll, you know? But I had no idea the songs he had written. Of course, you know, the day the music died, I was in elementary school. And I was just listening to what was on AM radio, and if it was Buddy Holly, I had no idea who it was. But a lot of people who were around back then have, you know, just incredible memories of exactly what they were doing that day and the sense of loss they felt. I remember I was doing Coast to Coast one night, and I had a caller who called me and told me that he was in Florida, and the day that he heard about the plane crash that morning, that when he came to school, he put the American flag on upside down. which is a sign of distress.
Right.
And he said that everybody was calling the school because they thought the principal had died. And but, you know, it was just the impact on him.
Yes.
And he was just in his teens. So it had a major impact, not only in the United States, around the world, and his music is eternal. I mean, people are going through the influences of Buddy Holly, where there was the Beatles, which was the very first song they recorded. They borrowed a friend's cassette recorder and recorded That'll Be the Day. So everybody was into Buddy Holly that came out in the 60s and was old enough to hold an electric guitar and get in a band with 3 or 4 other members and create dreams and visions for a future.
Well, I was not born yet when he died, 5 years before I was even born. But when I listened to Buddy Holly, not to take anything away from the pioneers, the Chuck Berrys, the Jerry Lee Lewises, but for me, Buddy Holly was almost in the same way the Beatles were when they released Revolver, almost like a different planet. His arrangements, I mean, 1957, 58, the arrangements, the strings, all of this, it was just out of this world.
It was. And he arranged this music for a 3-piece band. Well, actually, if Nicky Sullivan, it would have been 4-piece, you know, who was under
right, the rhythm guitarist, yeah.
But eventually, you know, it was the production that Buddy Holly was able to pull off, and the catchy lyrics, and you know, it was just great music, and it took rock and roll to another level. Everybody else you mentioned, if it was Little Richard, it was the piano, and you know, his vocals, but you had the same sort of R&B production. But Buddy Holly was revolutionary. It was different.
Absolutely. I'm going to get you to introduce our Mr. Guest here in just a moment.
Okay.
But let's just take a quick step back and talk about that ill-fated Winter Dance Party tour, which just was kind of a mess from the get-go, wasn't it?
Actually, it was. I mean, the buses, they were on school buses. They had no heat. The temperature was down to as low as 40 below zero. The guys on the bus were burning newspapers in the aisle to keep warm, and then they had to roll the windows down to get the smoke out and let the cold back in. And they would do 100 miles in one direction, do the show, then they'd have to go back the exact same direction and do another show. So it wasn't put together very well at all. And they were sitting on the school bus, traveling. Buddy Holly wanted to have his have his clothes laundered and to sleep in a bed for one night. The Big Bopper was sick, and nobody knows why Richie Valens flipped that coin, because he had a terrible fear of flying, but yet he did. And the day the music died, ever since Don McLean's song has told a story about February making me shiver, and bad news on the doorstep. So the lyrics is basically a history of rock and roll, and I think a lot of it has to do with how in the early days of rock and roll you just wanted to dance, and you know, the songs were just catchy and fun, and then it became very political, and then you went through the dark period. But Buddy Holly was, you know, always a figure of happiness, and his songs, I mean, he had some tearjerkers, but I mean, he had some, you know, just the production of his songs and the way he played, the arrangement, and how he influenced everybody that came after him. I mean, that's a legend. And I guess Danny and the Juniors were right. Rock and roll will never die, because it did survive for over 59 years, didn't it?
Quick question before we get to the guest, and that is, I've never understood this. Here was a Buddy Holly, a man, I mean, he had toured in Australia, you know, huge, at the top of his game in 1959. Why was he riding these, you know, buses with no heat, doing this disastrous tour?
Well, you know, our next guest is going to really have the definitive answer on that. But I mean, there's stories about he was in a lawsuit involving his publishing, so he really wasn't making that kind of money, and that he needed to go out on the road, and that was the only tour available. And if that was the case, then it was really, really sad. But I know that there were some legal issues that forced him out, and I'm sure he did not want to be on that bus, but, you know, he was going to stick it out. And sadly, you know, just the whole idea of getting a plane on that night, and, you know, but there's so many things that are basically not correct about the day the plane crashed. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we're still learning. So, I mean, the story's going to live forever. And our next guest will have a lot to bring up about all this, because I think your audience is going to enjoy it.
Okay, well, we're coming up on a break here, so we're going to introduce her right after the break. There's her first clue. I've said she is going to come right on after the break. But before we get to the break, Gary, I just want to give people a little sense of where else we're going with this discussion tonight regarding Buddy Holly, because your forte really is delving into a lot of and unraveling a lot of the mysteries and the curses. And one of the amazing, well, not amazing, one of the tragic aspects of this story is I don't know if you call it a curse, the Buddy Holly curse, but the figures that were attached in some way or associated with Buddy Holly that also met an early demise. Just give us a kind of a sense of that as we head into the break here.
Well, if you take a look at it, there's so many names that were touched by it. Like, for instance, Joe Meek, who was one of the greatest English producers, had predicted that through a tarot card reading that Buddy Holly would die on February 3rd. You had Ronnie Smith, who took Buddy's place on the Winter Dance Party tour, that as soon as the tour is over, he checks himself into a sanitarium and he hangs himself. David Box became the singer in the Crickets and did the song Peggy Sue Got Married that was released, and he left the band and was killed in a plane crash, just about the same age as Buddy Holly. Bobby Fuller, who wrote I Fought the Law and the Law Won, he didn't write it. He recorded it. It was written by Sonny Curtis, but he died in mysterious cases, and he was supposed to be the new Buddy Holly. And then, I guess, as we look further, you have Keith Moon from The who died on Buddy Holly's birthday, and the night before he attended the opening of the Buddy Holly story in London. And then you had Mark Bolan from T-Rex, who, when he had his car accident, they found a badge that he was wearing that said every day is a holiday. And then you would have Tupac Shakur, who was shot on Buddy Holly's birthday.
I'm going to stop you right there. That's enough to fill a show. All right, Gary. We will take a time out, and we'll come back with our special guest as we talk about the day the music died. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett.
That'll be the day when I die.
This is no place for the naive or the faint-hearted. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
If you knew Peggy Sue, then you'd know why I feel blue without Peggy. My Peggy Sue. Oh, well, I love you, Kelly. I love you, Peggy Sue.
All right, well, there's another audio clue as to the identity of our guest. Gary Patterson is with us. Rock and roll investigator, the author of The Walrus Was Paul, Tales from the Rock and Roll, Hellhounds on Their Trail, Tales from the Rock and Roll Graveyard, and many others. We'll get Gary now to introduce our special guest.
Well, Richard, it's a great honor for me to introduce to your audience the very first goddess of rock and roll, when guys stopped writing about their cars like Maybelline and wrote about special girls in their life. And the song you just heard, Peggy Sue, has probably been recorded so many times by so many different artists, and actually still sounds as fresh today as it did when Buddy Holly recorded it. So let's bring on Miss Peggy Sue Guerin from Lubbock, Texas.
Ah, Peggy Sue, welcome to The Conspiracy Show. How are you?
Oh, well, thank you so much, Richard. I'm so thrilled to be on here with you and Gary. I just can't even tell you.
Well, we are delighted to have you. Wow, almost 60 years, 57 years. How does it feel? Time must have flown by, I'm guessing.
Well, it has. It always feels like yesterday. Something you never ever forget. You know, when you have somebody that you love and they're a close friend and you're involved in a project, and we thought rock and roll was the most important thing there was in life, and as it turned out it was, you know. So it's always fresh.
Take us back to those heady days in Lubbock, Texas. You met Jerry Allison, who was the drummer, would become the drummer with the Crickets at Lubbock High, where Jerry and you and Buddy all attended. Tell me how you and Jerry met, and then how you and Buddy met.
Well, I met Jerry actually when I was in the 7th grade. So he played drums in the junior high band. And so when I got into high school, he, of course, was in the senior band, and so was I. I played first year alto saxophone. And I met Buddy when I was 15 in high school, and he had graduated the year before me coming into high school. So as I was leaving high school to go out to the band room, he was coming in and he knocked me down, and so that's kind of how our first meeting occurred.
Just like in the movies. Just like in the movies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And what was he like as a young man? Well, I mean, he died a young man, but I mean, what was he like then?
He was a neat guy. He never bragged. You never knew that he had going what he had going, and he was always so common. I mean, he was so interested in other people and what they're doing. It didn't matter what you did on his recording sessions. He always had time to thank you for, I mean, it didn't matter if you clapped your hands on the session, you know. It was like, thank you so much for playing on my section. So he was just very humble, very nice, very low-key. He did have a temper. He could have a temper. But most of the time it just, just didn't show. But he was just a nice guy.
And how soon after high school was it apparent that Buddy Holly and the Crickets were destined for greatness?
Well, in 1957, That'll Be the Day was a hit. And they had written the song after the movie The Searchers, with John Wayne saying That'll Be the Day. And Buddy said, well, we wrote it in an hour and 15 minutes, and they recorded it, and of course it was a huge hit. But That'll Be the Day, and then the hits came, started to follow after that. So that was 57, 58, 59. Yeah.
And Gary, I'll get you to jump in at any time, of course.
Oh, I'm enjoying the story.
But when did you and Jerry fall in love and marry?
My senior year in high school, I was going to a girls' Catholic school in Sacramento, and he had his mother call my mother in Lubbock, Texas, and see if I could come to the rock show in the Sacramento Memorial Auditorium. And my mother said, well, yeah, I think she can attend. That's okay. And my sister, I was living with my sister and brother-in-law who were stationed in Sacramento in the United States Air Force. And so we invited Jerry Allison. We also invited Buddy to stay. But like Buddy said, well, we can get another drummer, but we can't get another Buddy Holly to stand in for my place. So Jerry Allison spent the weekend, and we took him back to the tour to join the tour that weekend. So that was kind of the new relationship we had started. We didn't have a very good one when I was in high school, but it was kind of up and down and what have you. But he had changed a lot, and so had I. So that's kind of where the relationship started.
And I wish we had 3 hours to talk of Peggy Sue. So we have to sort of jump ahead, and it does it really a disservice to the story. But
right.
What led to Jerry and Buddy, parting ways sort of professionally?
Well, they went on. We got married. Jerry Allison and I got married July 22nd, 1958, and Buddy and Maria Elena got married in August 14th, right after that. We honeymooned in Acapulco, and they came back and went on the road. I kind of fill you in on some personal details, but I didn't go on that tour because our new Impala was broken. And Buddy said, that's all right, you can ride with Maria Elena and I. And I said, no, that's okay. I'll meet all of you in New York. You just go ahead and do the tour. By the time the tour was over, everybody was angry at everybody. It was like the worst situation I have ever walked into. I flew into New York to meet all of them, and it was really very difficult. So Jerry had been doing his thing. By that I mean he was drinking and making new relationships, or friendships, shall I say.
Ah, very delicately
put. And Buddy was
yeah.
extremely upset over it. And Buddy was also very unhappy in his own marriage. So by the time I got to New York, just to meet up with everybody. Everybody was at odds with each other.
But your friendship with Buddy remained even after the sort of the dissolution of the Crickets as.
Oh, absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we would have. Buddy had already got the architect to drop the plans for the recording studio here in Lubbock and the house that his mom and dad were going to live in, which was a gift to his mother and daddy on his birthday. And we would have, he would have had the recording studio here and produced records. Decca had already offered to put up the financing, and it would have been business as usual the next day, but we just didn't get that far.
Again, I invite you, Gary, to jump in any time if you want to add anything or ask Peggy Sue a question.
Maybe.
Yeah, go ahead.
What we ought to do is go back to the song, because there seems to be a lot of information that hints at the idea the song was never really entitled Peggy Sue at first. It was called Cindy Lou. So what do you think about that, Peggy?
I think that's awful, Gary, that you'd even bring it up.
Why did I invite him? Why did I invite him?
I know. You hear it, and my answer is this, because if it was written about Buddy Holly's niece, and I sort of know where the information came from, why did Buddy Holly write 2 songs about you? Because the second song was Peggy Sue Got Married.
Right. Well, when I wrote my book, Whatever Happened to Peggy Sue, which is new, I have a new book out there on Amazon.com. Richard, thank you. And when I wrote the book, I went back to the Norman Petty studio and to the vault, and I said, Kenneth is the head of the Norman Petty estate. Kenneth Broad is. And I said, okay, if there's a song here named Cindy Lou, I want to find it. Because Buddy never wrote a song that he didn't write the chords down or the lyrics down. And recorded it. And we could find nothing. There was no Cindy Lou whatsoever. None. Zip, zero, nada, nothing. So I just went from that, and I went, there was no Cindy Lou. Well, that came out in an interview on the Buddy Holly story with John Goldrosen many years back, and I just kind of thought, well, okay, that was sour grapes coming from Jerry Allison. But we could find nothing that had to do with Cindy Lou. But he did write Peggy Sue Got Married, and he wrote his parents a letter, and he said, now don't tell her, because this is a surprise, and I want her to be surprised. Well, he wasn't talking about Maria Elena, because Maria Elena was there with him. So he was talking about me, and it was a total surprise and shock when I heard it. Of course, unfortunately, I heard it after he had died. But
How do you know how Buddy's wife Maria responded, or how she reacted when he wrote this song? I mean, was there any sort of jealousy there between the two of you?
Well, there was a lot of a lot of very cold feelings between the two of us. She was 9 years older than I. And so there just was not a lot of communication between her and I.
So how much older than Buddy was she?
5.
She was 5 years older than Buddy.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, and she was 9 years older than I.
Do you remember the first time you heard that song played on the radio?
Peggy Sue Got Married?
Or Peggy Sue?
Oh, yes. The first time I ever heard Peggy Sue was at the Sacramento Memorial Auditorium when Buddy performed it. And then after that, I heard it on the radio. But the first time I ever heard it was on stage with him performing it.
How did that feel?
It was wonderful. I mean, they were doing what they wanted to do, and they wanted to entertain, and they were so happy at what they were doing, and especially Buddy.
And, I mean, how does that, when you're walking around and other people are listening to that song and maybe they don't know you, I mean, are you bursting inside wanting to tell, they're singing about me?
No, I don't do that.
You're a better person than I am. I mean, I would be telling everybody I know.
No, I don't do that anymore. It's like I go, really? You like Peggy Sue? Well, that's great. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The only thing I did do, Jerry and I went to Baden, Germany in November.
Yes, we
and
did.
I got to meet John Wayne's granddaughter. And, of course, that's where the idea of That'll Be the Day came from.
Right.
And so I said, I just have to thank you, even though you're not your grandfather. But thank you so much for That'll Be the Day. And she just died laughing.
Interesting, source of inspiration for a song, isn't it? A line from a movie like that.
It is.
We are coming up on another break, but we'll get this conversation started here, and then we'll continue after. But in the days or weeks leading up to the plane crash, you had some ominous dreams.
Yes, I did.
Can you share those with us?
Oh, yes, I can.
Yeah, well, let's start now, and then we'll continue after as well.
Okay.
Yeah, no, go ahead now, and then we have a couple minutes, and then then when we break, and then we'll...
I think it was October. I had a dream where this small plane went up in the air, and I thought it was Buddy, Jerry, and Joe B on the airplane with the pilot. But I saw the plane go up, and then I saw it circle around the airport, and I saw it come straight down. And so I was just frantic. It was one of those nightmare things you have. And so the next day I said, "You can't. I don't want you to get a small plane. I don't want you to rent one. I don't want you to lease one." And I told Betty the same thing. And he said, "Now listen, I'm safer up in the air than I am on the ground because there's more accidents on the ground than there is up in the air." And I said, "No, you don't understand. This plane came down." So I had this dream 3 times, and the second time I had it, I told him again. He said, "No, quit worrying about it. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen." And I really thought it was Jerry and Joe B in the airplane with him. Of course, as it turned out, it was not. But it was really strange. And the third time I had the dream, I knew that we were going to have a plane crash somewhere. And oddly enough, Richard, on February 2nd, we were on our way. Jerry Allison had broken away from Buddy Holly, unfortunately for Jerry Allison, but we were on our way back to Lubbock, Texas to stay with his parents, and we're driving back to Lubbock on this 2-lane road, and here is this truck that's parked up on the left side of the lane. We're going on the right side of the lane, and all of a sudden this body hit the hood of our car, and Jerry slowed down, and we turned around, and it was a truck driver. I mean, he had jumped in front of the car and just came down on the hood of the car. So we got the police, and we got the ambulance, and we took him to the hospital, and we gave the report to the police of what had happened, and we went on to Lubbock, and it was late when we got in. And when we got there, we stayed with Mr. and Miss Allison because it was late. Sonny Curtis was also with us. And it's like this body had just dropped from the air. And
oh my.
Yeah. And this was February 2nd, going toward the 3rd. And so the phone was ringing the next morning, and Sonny Curtis came in and woke Jerry Allison up, and he said, you need to answer the phone because they're saying the crickets are dead. So Jerry got up and started answering the phone, and I sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and read all the papers that came in, the newspapers that came in. And I couldn't believe that all of this was happening at the same time. It was just like, it was like the dreams, and the plane went down, and then all of a sudden we had this body dropping down on the hood of the car, and we ended up in a lawsuit. We won, but it was just, it was all very, very funny, very strange.
Very strange indeed. All right, we'll take a time out. Whatever happened to Peggy Sue? Well, she's right here on the program, The Conspiracy Show. Peggy Sue Guerin, along with good friend R. Gary Patterson. We'll be back with more in a moment.
Oh, the little things you say and do make me want to be with you. Rain on its crazy feeling, and I know it's got me reeling when you say I love you.
Corporations, governments, and sometimes entire civilizations. What goes up must come down. And it lands on The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Maybe, baby, I'll have you. Maybe, baby, you'll be true. Maybe, baby, I'll have you for me.
I mean, listen to that sound. That's at least 10 years ahead of its time, at least. Wouldn't you say, Gary?
Oh, exactly.
All right. Peggy Sue Guerin is with us as well, along with our Gary Patterson. She's the girl next door and the subject of the immortal Peggy Sue, and Peggy Sue got married by Buddy Holly. If I can just throw this over to you now, Gary, and go back to that fateful day, February 3rd, and talk to me about sort of the seating arrangements and who decided, how it was decided, who would go on the plane and who would stay on the bus and so forth.
Basically what happened was that they'd been on the road, and Buddy Holly wanted to get his clothes laundered, and he wanted to sleep in a warm bed and not a school bus with no heat with 40 below temperatures. So he chartered the plane. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Peggy Sue can talk about this as well. But I know that the Big Bopper had the flu, and he talked to Waylon Jennings about if he could have Waylon's seat on the plane, because it was Buddy and the band, which in that case would have been Waylon Jennings and Tommy Alsop, because Carl Bunch had been hospitalized with frostbite on his feet.
Because of the tour, right? Because he was
That's
on that
right.
bus for much of the tour.
On that tour. So anyway, I think that Waylon always enjoyed the idea of hanging out with the guys, and the Big Bopper threw in his brand new sleeping bag that would keep him warm on the bus. So it wasn't hard to talk Waylon into it. And, of course, Waylon Jennings always told the story that when they went to the airport, that as he saw them get in, the Big Bopper got in first behind the pilot, and Richie Valens the next seat in the back, and Buddy in the co-pilot seat. And as Buddy was getting on the plane, he turns to Waylon and he says, "Hey, Waylon, I hope you freeze your butt off in that old school bus." And then Waylon says, "Yeah, and I hope your old plane crashes."
Oh, dear.
And he said he never got over that because that was the last thing he ever said to Buddy Holly.
Of course. Now, so if I could jump in, Gary, now, correct me if I'm wrong. Was it Waylon that did the coin toss with Richie Valens?
No.
Okay.
It was Tommy Alsop. And this is what's strange, because Richie Valens had a terrible fear of flying. And actually he was convinced that he would die in a plane crash. And he went to his grandfather's funeral. And the day he went to the funeral, two planes collided over the junior high school he attended in California. The pieces of the plane rained down on the playground.
Oh, my.
And every day Richie would bring his guitar and he'd sit under this tree. And he'd play and all the kids would be gathered around him. Well, that day he wasn't there. And when the plane crashed, it killed his best friend.
Oh, my.
So this really fueled it even more. So for me, to think that Richie Valens would want that seat in a plane, I mean, unless he was a star. I mean, it was supposed to be for the stars, whatever. So Tommy Alsop, he wasn't at the airport. They come back to check on the equipment at the surf ballroom, and he sees Tommy Alsop there, and he says, "Hey, Tommy, let me have that seat." And Tommy says, "Well, let's flip it." So they flipped a coin, and it was heads, and Richie Valens says, "This is the first time I ever won," because it was heads. And he took the last seat on the plane. And Tommy Alsop, back in Texas, started a bar that he called the Heads Up Saloon because it saved his life. Now, there's another story, and that story is with Dion, from Dion and the Belmonts, who says that he was actually offered the seat, but he didn't want to spend the money because it would be what he would pay for a month's rent in his apartment in New York. So you have that version, you have the version with Tommy Alsop. It's just really strange that the Tommy Alsop story has started ever since then and has been going strong, and all at once this one comes through. But Peggy Sue may want to give an opinion on that, too, on the coin toss. What do you think, Peggy?
Well, I have to go with Tommy Alsop. I knew him personally, and I just know he isn't lying. I mean, he didn't make it up. So.
Well, they were both on the tour, but, Tommy was closer to Buddy as far as being in the band.
Sure.
I'm sure they were all good friends.
Well, and Tommy took care of our dance band, and then he graduated up to being a cricket when the Crickets left Buddy Holly when they had the separation. So I just have to go with Tommy Alsop on that.
There's another story that, Gary, you have shared with me, and that involves Carl Bunch, who was, as you say, recovering from frostbite in a hospital. Mm-hmm. Both of you, either of you, care to share what Carl Bunch experienced that night while in the hospital bed?
Well, actually, Peggy Sue and I did a interview on Pop Odyssey with Carl Bunch. It's probably his last interview. As he was talking, he was going to be a dancer like Fred Astaire. So when he went on the road, he was like 17 years old. He was the same age as Ritchie Valens, and he and Ritchie were close. So when he was in the hospital early morning on February 3rd, he wakes up, and he told us that he saw Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Ritchie Valens standing next to his bed, and they were smiling at him. And he was staring at them, and they stood there, and he said then they vanished, just disappeared. And he had heard just a few hours later that they had been killed in a plane crash, but he was convinced, till the day he died, that they had come back to visit him one final time after the plane crash. And Carl Bunch, wasn't he a psychologist, Peggy Sue?
Yes, he was. Yes.
So he's not some guy, who was not credible. And being a psychologist, he understands, all the theories behind it, but yet, he was very sincere in that. And it was a very powerful moment.
I'll say, listen, I've got to take a time out. We will come back. R. Gary Patterson and Peggy Sue Guerin, Whatever Happened to Peggy Sue, her memoir, now available on Amazon as a trade paperback and available on Kindle. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
You want the truth? You can handle the truth. The Conspiracy Show.
Hold me close and tell me how you feel. Tell me love is real.
All right, welcome back to The Conspiracy Show. Richard Syrett, along with good friend R. Gary Patterson, and you'll want to check out his website, rgarypatterson.com, and Peggy Sue Guerin, Whatever Happened to Peggy Sue, her memoir, available on Amazon in a trade paperback and also available on Kindle. Buddy's widow, 6 months pregnant at the time, she miscarried, I guess, due to the trauma, and never attended his funeral or ever visited his grave, I'm told. Is that true?
Well, that's true, Richard, but she wasn't pregnant.
She wasn't? She wasn't?
She was not. No. She was not pregnant, and she did not attend the funeral. She's never been back to where Buddy has been buried in Lubbock, and so no, none of that occurred.
How did that story get started, that she was 6 months pregnant and miscarried? Did she start it?
That came from her camp,
Why would she say something like that?
Because she was writing a story, Buddy Holly story, and none of which was true. And Mr. and Miss Holly sued over that because the Buddy Holly story with Jerry Busey in it.
Yes.
It just was not accurate, and they sued and they won. So.
All right. The Beechcraft Bonanza plane that was chartered from, was it Hubert Dwyer? I think, was it Hugh Dwyer, Gary?
Jerry Dwyer.
Jerry Dwyer. Where is that? That plane is still around somewhere, the wreckage, correct?
Well, I think it's been confiscated. That's what I think. I think somebody came in and took the plane away, and I had hoped that this last year they were going to reopen the case, but they didn't do that. But I don't know where the plane is, but I don't think Jerry Dwyer has it.
Did Jerry not just pass away as well?
Yes, he did.
Yes, he did.
And see, let me just throw in something that about a year, maybe 2 years ago, and Peggy knows this, I got a phone call from a member of the Dwyer family, and actually his wife. And I'd talked to her a few times earlier, and she had called me, and I think what she wanted to do was have me write a book on their version of what happened. And, of course, that version has to do with a hole in the back of the pilot's seat that supposedly was a bullet hole, that it wasn't the pilot's fault. But what they don't, or maybe they do understand, was that there was only one autopsy performed from the plane crash, and that was on the pilot because of regulations, and they didn't find a bullet hole. But when she was talking to me, I just asked her, I said, I've got a question. I said, do you have the plane? And when I said that, it got very, very quiet.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
And then she said, we have some of it.
We have some of it. Mm-hmm. So what's the mystery here? What do you think? Is someone hiding something?
Yes.
Do you care to elaborate on that, Peggy Sue?
Yes, I would like to elaborate on that because I went to Beechcraft and I said, if I can get the airplane, would you help me find out what happened to this airplane? And they said, we'll do that for free. We'll put it in computers. We'll find out exactly what happened to that airplane. But there was no airplane. We couldn't find it. And Jerry Dwyer was not real helpful in helping us find it. And so whatever happened to the airplane, I think it was confiscated. I think they may have left him a few pieces, but I think it was confiscated after the crash. And I think the reason for that is because there were ulterior motives of why it crashed, and I'm being polite.
Wait a minute. I mean, it was late at night. It was, we're told, poor wintry weather conditions. But so you don't think that's... No? There was
no snow coming in. We had no wind. We had no snow coming in when the plane took off. It had been de-iced. It had its annual. And now I learned to take off and land in a Bonanza, which was the same thing. It's a little bit newer model than that one. But there was nothing wrong with that airplane when it was pulled out there to take off. Now, maybe it was overloaded. I will go there. Maybe they had too much stuff on the back of it that they stuck in there. But as far as I can tell, there was nothing wrong with the airplane.
Well, Gary, J.P. Richardson was a pretty hefty guy. Yes. It's been suggested, maybe I probably heard this from you, Gary. I get all my information from you. that maybe the Big Bopper was trying to change seats mid-flight. Is that possible?
There was a theory that the Big Bopper had been sick, and he was sitting behind the pilot. And someone had made a suggestion that there may have been Buddy and the Big Bopper trying to change seats as the plane was taking off, which would really have thrown it off balance. And that was just one of the rumors. You got to remember, after this plane crash, we don't know what happened. And, everybody goes out and they do conjecture, well, what if this happened? And the other thing was that when the plane crashed, Buddy's body was found on one side of the fuselage and Richie Valens on the other. And the pilot was still in the plane, but the Big Bopper had been thrown 40 feet in front of the plane.
Which never happens.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, if he was behind the pilot, I mean, the plane really had to break up and throw him out so he would bypass the pilot on the way out, but 40 feet in front over a fence. So, maybe someday we'll get the answer, but there's a lot of conjecture to what happened on the day the music died. And matter of fact, Don McLean, who wrote the song, was charged not too long ago, and I think for domestic violence. So anytime you're coming up to February 3rd, I guess strange things happen, don't they?
We just have a few moments, but Peggy, I understand that I don't know, in the last several years, relatively recently, you. Forgive me if I'm wrong here, but I seem to recall hearing something about you feeling that Buddy has reached out to you.
Oh, yeah. I have constant communication with him.
Can you share a little bit of that in the time that remains?
Well, I can. First of all, there are many things that have gone wrong through his career, and he's very angry about it. And I don't blame him. I understand that. But you have to realize he's 22 at his thinking. So I understand what he is saying. It's just that there's no way to go back and prove what it is he's saying.
How does he communicate with you?
Mentally. Yeah.
And what is he saying in terms of? I mean, does he? What does he claim happened on that plane?
He was on the right side of the pilot. He had no idea what was wrong with the plane. The Big Bopper and Richie Valens were in the back. I think Richie Valens had a cold, as a matter of fact, just why he took that plane seat. But he knew, I think he knew immediately when it went up and the RPMs went up on the motor and it wasn't going to come down, that he was in trouble. I think he knew immediately then. And I think he knew he was murdered.
Murdered?
Well, I call it that, but
all right. Someone
you may call it something else.
Someone sabotaged the plane.
Yes. Somebody sabotaged the plane. If somebody came and sabotaged the plane, and somebody knows that, now maybe they're dead now and they are not going to speak from the grave, but something happened to that airplane.
Any idea why? What would the motive be? Does Buddy Holly have any idea?
I think that it was the fact that I think there were a couple of things that were in play here. I think that the truly evil side of the world decided that if they could get rid of rock and roll, it would be okay. But the truth of the matter is that I think that the plane went down because they were going to get rid of rock and roll. And I think Buddy Holly was the epitome of rock and roll.
Certainly was.
Mm-hmm.
Peggy Sue, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Well, Richard, I want to tell you that I just love you on Coast to Coast. I'm in America at Lubbock, Texas, but I listen to you every chance I get.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. I was going to ask you about Lubbock. I was going to ask you about Lubbock, Texas. One of my favorite songs is Mac Davis. Although
course.
Lubbock, Texas, in my rearview mirror. But what was he thinking?
Absolutely.
He wants to get out of Lubbock, Texas.
You know, he and I graduated the same year in 1958.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, we did.
It's a great song. And
it is.
Imagine,
it's love.
What's the population of Lubbock?
It's about 200,000.
200,000. And Buddy Holly, Mac Davis, and Peggy Sue Guerin. That's three pretty impressive people to come out of Lubbock, Texas.
Well, thank you so much.
Again, let's remind listeners that Whatever Happened to Peggy Sue, this amazing memoir, now available on Amazon in paperback and also available on Kindle. If you're
thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much. And our Gary, always a pleasure having you on, my friend.
Always glad, and be back again next time. We'll do it again.
All right, let's give folks rgarypatterson.com. All right, thank you both. Peggy Sue Guerin and the late, great R. Gary Patterson. You will be missed, my friend. We will resume next week with our regular format. We'll have our panelists and lots of great guests, as well as open lines. What's in the box? Of course, the live YouTube stream will continue as well. In the meantime, my thanks to Ian Robertson behind the glass, as always, for his capable work, and young willpower. Thanks to you as well, Albert Venzel and Ryan White. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light, and what I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite, I'm coming home. Good night.